We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
RT reports China says it wants to help build a multipolar world. Foreign Minister Wang Yi told his Russian colleague, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that Beijing will work with Moscow. This after President Putin recently said during his Val d'Isle speech, "I am convinced that real democracy in a multipolar world is primarily about the ability of any nation, I emphasize, any society or civilization, to follow its own path and organize its own socio-political system," end quote. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So my question is, why can't or won't the U.S. join the party? I mean, Biden and Blinken et al., they talk about democracy. They play around with the concept of sovereignty. Why don't they just get into the game?
Well, I think the answer is obvious. That is to say that U.S. imperialism prefers what has been referred to in the past as a unipolar world that has been referred to contemporaneously as the so-called rules-based international order, or RUBIO. That is to say, the United States makes the rules and all others have to line up in order. And it is hotly opposed to a multipolar world, to a polycentric world, because that obviously constrains and constricts U.S. imperialism. But the question for today, is it too late for U.S. imperialism to object? The tentative answer is yes. We see that reflected in what has been going on in the past few days in Bali, Indonesia, with the meeting of the Group of 20, the G20. Recall that the G20 only arose a few years ago. And obviously, it was a response to the so-called G7. That is to say, the United States, its North Atlantic allies, plus Japan. As the G7 began to lose altitude with the rise of China, there was no alternative but to organize the G20, which is now the major forum with regard to settling and debating international issues, although the G7 still operates as a kind of caucus within the G20. And I'm afraid to say, however, that the days of unipolarity are certainly numbered.
Where do you think, if I may, two countries I'll throw out there, their names, I think they're very important to the formation of this new world economic order, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Your thoughts?
Well, let's take Turkey first. Turkey is quite upset with Washington nowadays. You recall that what happened a few days ago with the bombing in the center of Istanbul, the major Turkish city. The Turks pointed the finger of accusation at Kurdish forces in Syria, backed by U.S. imperialism. In fact, Ankara fundamentally rejected the apology and the regrets proffered by Washington because it sees Washington as part of the problem. This is no minor matter since Turkey, as is well known, is the eastern anchor of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And despite the fact that Ankara has been able to maintain relations with Moscow, despite the special military operation in Ukraine, you still see that Turkey, a la being a key NATO member, is cooperating with the NATO forces in Ukraine, helping to supply the Ukrainian regime with drones, which have been quite effective. However, I suspect and expect that the relations between Washington and Ankara will continue to deteriorate. In fact, don't be surprised if Turkey turns thumbs down on the ascension to NATO of Sweden and Finland. Of course, it requires unanimity. because Turkey feels that these two Scandinavian regimes are much too friendly with Kurdish forces, which Turkey sees as a danger to their current regime. With regard to Saudi Arabia, you should take seriously this talk about Saudi Arabia trying to join the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You should take seriously this idea that Saudi Arabia may be moving away from this petrodollar, that is to say the major oil supplier being Riyadh, basically pricing their prime commodity, speaking of petroleum, in dollars, which obviously gives Washington leverage, which means that nations which want to purchase the lifeblood of the economy, speaking of oil, have to round up dollars. That may no longer obtain within the next few months or certainly the next few years. And what you may see is the rise of a petro renminbi, speaking of the Chinese currency. China and Saudi Arabia are becoming ever more close as we speak. And once again, I think that Washington's ham-fisted approach to Saudi Arabia has not paid dividends. In fact, it has led to the current crisis.
I just want to follow up on your point about Turkey. And over the last few years, President Erdogan has been very proficient and very adept at straddling the fence as it relates to relations between Russia and the United States. And do you see now that we're getting to the point where Erdogan is no longer where he's made the decision whether he wants to fish or cut bait, and that he now is he going to have to make a hard decision? And once that decision is made, it's looking as though he's going to have to go with the side of the multipolar world versus the unipolar world.
Well, that is a distinct possibility. Recall that it was in the summer of 2016 that the Erdogan government was almost overthrown because of a military rebellion, a military coup. The Erdogan regime pointed the finger of accusation once again at Washington, which, as you know all too well, refuses to extradite his major opponent, speaking of Fethullah Gulen, who is comfortably sited in the Poconos in Pennsylvania. And so it would not surprise us at all if Mr. Erdogan makes the strategic decision to move decisively away from the North Atlantic bloc, which, after all, continues to thumb its nose at Turkey in light of the fact that it has been a candidate member of the European Union for oh so long. The fact that the Central Asian states, which Turkey is becoming ever more close to, are increasingly orienting towards Beijing and Moscow, and therefore Ankara, in order to maintain the pace, will probably have to do the same thing. But we shall see, because Washington has in its back pocket the ultimate disciplining measure, which is supporting a military coup once again against Mr. Erdogan.
RT reports China says it wants to help build a multipolar world. Wang Yi told his Russian colleague Sergei Lavrov, quote, China is ready to work with Russia and other like-minded countries to promote the development of a multipolar world, firmly support the democratization of international relations, and defend the international system based on the United Nations. It sounds as though, there are people arguing that World War III has already started. Well, if the kinetic part of it is in Ukraine, it sounds as though the diplomatic/economic portion of World War III is being fought by a combination of China and Russia. Your thoughts?
Well, certainly, I think that I think it's time to start moving past this idea that a multipolar world, a polycentric world, is on the horizon. I think it's already arrived, quite frankly, and I think that helps to explain the scramble in the North Atlantic camp. Recall that before Chancellor Scholz made his path-breaking visit to China just a few days ago, there was serious discussion of a joint French-German delegation to China, which would have been much more of a game changer than Mr. Chancellor Scholz arriving on his own with a delegation and a plane full of leading business executives. So I think that this polycentric world is already underway. It's in motion. You see it in Latin America with the shift to the left, capped off by the election of Lula da Silva, who, by the way, is speaking and addressing the COP27 meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, probably as we speak, and an address that's eagerly anticipated and eagerly awaited. And so Washington is going to have to adjust. And I'm afraid to tell Washington that it has problem in its own backyard, so-called, because AMLO, the president of Mexico, is organizing a Latin American bloc that consciously excludes the United States and China, but it includes most of these left-leaning regimes in the hemisphere, starting with Brazil and, of course, including Cuba. Cuba, of course, excluded from this so-called Summit of the Americas that was held in Southern California just a few months ago. So once again, I think that multipolarity is here, and you can see it in the scramble that you now find in the North Atlantic bloc.
Following up on that point with Mexico and AMLO, do you see there being some inconsistency with AMLO looking to form this bloc with the countries that you mentioned, including Cuba, but at the same time backing the U.S. play on trying to develop an international force to invade Haiti?
Well, we have to realize that Mexico, like the United States, has a very powerful right-wing bloc. And in fact, the right wing in Mexico collaborates with the right wing in the United States. That leads to constraints on the regime in Mexico City. That leads, once again, to this attempt for a multilateral force in Haiti, which, by the way, has not taken place. And I think that if we were able to dig into the diplomatic cable traffic, we might find that that was not an accident, that was not a coincidence, that perhaps wiser heads in the foreign ministry in Mexico City decided to slow down and slow walk this proposal precisely because they did not want it necessarily to float and therefore capitulate to the domestic right wing.
Do you think that I'm sure the Saudis recognize the danger. Do you see them making a move when they get in BRICS to start accepting the yuan, start accepting other currencies that would significantly impact the petrodollar and, needless to say, the U.S. economy?
Well, certainly, because I think that the Saudi Arabian regime is vulnerable. Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader, has cultivated many enemies, particularly domestic enemies. I think we've talked on this program before about what happened a few months ago when he invited a number of princes to a meeting and then detained them all and then shook them down for wealth that supposedly would go into the treasury, but apparently went into buying more bubbles for MBS himself. And I would dare say that MBS probably needs to tighten his security, and he probably needs to have his intelligence agents, which I'm sure they're doing, keep an eye on those restive princes who he has shaken down in the past.
Global Times, voices of cooperation drown out decoupling calls as $74 billion inked at Shanghai CIIE. Multinational companies have bagged more deals in terms of value, totaling $73.5 billion at this year's China International Import Expo. That seems to me, we have just a minute, that seems to me to go a long way in kind of putting some wind in the sails of President Xi as he walked through the G20.
Well, there's been a lot of loose talk in Washington and Wall Street about decoupling from the Chinese economy. There's been a lot of loose talk about so-called friendshoring, that is to say, moving U.S. companies away from China towards so-called friends, Mexico in the first instance, as it borders the United States. But I'm afraid to say that the time may be past for those measures to take flight because the two economies are so deeply intertwined that if Washington and the United States tried to move away from China, it would be the equivalent of shooting itself in the foot because Germany would not do the same. France would not do the same. Japan would not do the same. And so Washington, I'm afraid to say, is cornered like the trapped rat that it is.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.